Hi and welcome to another episode of The Leadership Enigma. Am I welcoming you to or back to The Leadership Enigma? I don't know, but hopefully you'll find us on all your major podcast platforms and also, I keep saying this, on our wonderful YouTube channel as well. Now we know, don't we, that diversity of thought is incredible in relation to what we're able to accomplish together. It's something that we have to embrace. It's something that we have to have the courage in order to identify and bring in. How do we actually leverage that diversity of thought? What does it actually really mean for our organisations and for our leaders? So this is a topic I've been looking forward to chatting about. So again, you know how this works. Come back to me just after the break, where I'll be talking to the wonderful Conder, who will help us answer a number of these questions. And Sue has got an amazing background: psychologist, business advisor, leadership expert. Oh, she'll tell you more about it. Come back to me just after this.
You're listening to The Leadership Enigma, powered by Transform Performance International, a podcast for the insatiably curious to explore the power of human-centered leadership to create real momentum for positive and sustainable change. Whether you're an entrepreneur, business owner, or corporate executive, each week we speak to global experts, academics, rising stars, ambitious upstarts, and disruptors as we discover that success leaves clues. Now, here's your host, Adam Pacifico.
So Sue, it's a big warm welcome to the Leadership Enigma. How are you?
I'm very well, and it's a pleasure to be here, Adam.
I'm so glad. We were just, weren't we? We were both excited that we were together in the studio, and there's definitely something about that face-to-face proximity, isn't there?
Absolutely. There's nothing that beats the real human connection.
And I think that really ties into the podcast because it's all about the human connection and human-centered leadership. Sue, I haven't done you any justice whatsoever in relation to an introduction. So tell the audience and the watchers a little bit about you and your background.
No, absolutely. I guess I've had a 30-year career really in what I call the people aspect of business and organisations.
Yep.
3 years ago, I left as a partner in the Deloitte's human capital consulting business and had a role there for many years, working across many different sectors, advising on people, leadership, how to actually enable organisations to really engage their people in large change programmes,
Yes.
organisation design. I also advised organisations on their HR talent agenda. So really, it's always fascinated me how people think and how they behave. I'm also an occupational psychologist with the British Psychological Society, and also a leadership coach. But now what I do is I focus on both coaching but also delivering leadership development programs because I'm in the privileged position to do what I really, really enjoy and really am fulfilled by being able to make an impact and to support and help people in leadership roles.
So we met a couple of weeks ago and it was obvious that you had a real passion for people, and you've just described that focus. What's fueling that? Where do you think that came from? Or when did you realise that this was really what you wanted to do and what kind of gave you energy?
Yeah, it started, Adam, when I was 17. See,
there's always a backstory, isn't there?
Yes, that's right. I guess my backstory is actually in the sixth form, I worked in the local Grantham Library.
Right.
Actually reshelving books that were brought in. In those days, it wasn't at all computerised. And I spotted books on psychology.
Right.
I took them out, and I guess then that's where it all started, because I was just so captivated and fascinated by what I was reading. And that led me to want to go and do psychology at university way before psychology became one of the most popular degree
it's
courses.
It's the thing to do now, isn't it?
Yes,
so many people are doing
but
it.
And that's where it started. So, and actually even
curve.
to, even this week, this day, I spend a lot of my hours, it's my hobby really. It's not just my work, it's my hobby. I love reading about...
If your work is your hobby, that's
work
bingo,
is my
right?
hobby now. Yeah, my work is my hobby now. I'm very, very fortunate to have found the thing that I just find inspiring, rewarding, and really, I guess, intellectually stimulating.
See, what I also love to hear as well is after a successful 30-year career, you were a partner in a huge professional services firm too, is that you're still incredibly enthusiastic and passionate about what you do. So to all the young leaders out there as well, find that passion, find that hobby, and if you can turn that into your work, then that really is the sweet spot, isn't it? Just give us a kind of an overview of the types of work that you find yourself doing now with clients.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to focus on quite a lot of programs. One of my lockdown projects actually was pulling together a lot of the material that I delivered over many, many years, looking at all the research. And I tend to do work in a number of areas. One of them is what I call the Human Leader Programme.
Right.
As we all know, leaders have really had to question the type of leader they are with the new expectations from people over the last number of years. That's really about connecting, engaging, using emotional intelligence, creating psychological safety, a whole range of things.
Well, that's that human-centered leadership piece, isn't it?
Absolutely,
Okay.
yeah. It's about leaders really tapping in to the people. At the end of the day, business and performance is all about people. It's the way people think, the way people behave that I always say has that line of sight to business and performance. And there's nothing else that's could really get leaders' attention better than that.
You can have a great strategy, can't you? But if you haven't got the right people, it's almost game over. Yeah. So, and you talked about change as well. And forgive me, I'm going backwards. I do this a lot, so forgive me, Sue. You talked about change, and I remember talking to a wonderful guest who I've had the chance to work with, and it's Tony O'Driscoll, who's a professor at Duke Fuqua. He talked about all change is people-centric change. Have you found that if you're talking to people, talking to leaders about change, you've really got to hone in on the people element of the change as opposed to just the process or the procedure of something?
I completely agree, Adam, with that. Having spent 3 decades almost looking at big change programs that focuses on the organisation design, the systems and the processes.
Which is important.
Very important as the backdrop, but equally as important, and it never ceases to amaze me how difficult it is sometimes to enable leadership teams to focus on what used to be called the soft issues, the pink and fluffy part of the
Not
change.
so pink and fluffy anymore, right?
No, that's right. It's actually the hard part to do.
Thank you for saying that, because do you remember that, I grew up with the term, people say soft skills. And I'd always, I think in my early days, I thought soft skills. But aren't those the hardest skills of all in some ways?
No, I completely so. And I've actually developed, one of my programs is the people dimension of change, and it really looks into the leader's role in helping their people make sense, helping their people really understand in a change context, what is it? What is in it for them? What maybe old ways or mindsets might be getting in the way of enabling them to fully embrace a new way of working? Because all change at the end of the day requires changes in the way people think and changes in behaviour, whether it's using a new computer system or whether it's collaborating differently across different teams. And then actually a lot of my work I use evidence and experience around behavioural science, around the psychology, and leaders that love data, that can create quite a new awareness about the importance of how do they tap into creating change for their people. And one of the phrases that I always use, that leaders are in the business of, in a way, generating new habits, but at scale.
Right.
Because change is all about doing things differently and, in fact, shifting from the old world to the new world. And it's about habits. As
the new world keeps changing itself as well, almost can't keep up. It's funny, I was chatting to one of my search colleagues and they were kind of asking, what is it that you do, Adam? And that's a useful question to reflect on. And I actually said most of what I do is about mindsets and behaviours. Do you find as well that most of what you do is mindset and behaviour?
Absolutely. And in fact, going back to my psychology background, one of the core aspects to all of my work is the positive psychology and what I call the cognitive triad. And it never ceases to amaze me how we don't use this more, both in businesses, which is the way we think affects the way we feel, which of course affects the way we behave. I mean, if I'm sitting here today and thinking, oh my goodness, I'm not going to do very well on this podcast, I'm going to feel anxious. It's going to affect the way that I'm talking, and of course the way I behave. And obviously the opposite is equally true. It never ceases to amaze me also why we don't do more in terms of educating around these mindset and behaviours at schools. That actually people have far more people and have far more influence on our mindset and behaviour than often we think we have.
The focus of this is the chemistry of difference. How does one identify, embrace, and leverage diversity? Before we do that, tell me, why has this been a focus for you, the identification and leveraging diversity? What's it all about?
I guess for me, over the years, I frequently had the thought that, are we sufficiently recognising the power of different ways of thinking and behaving? And typically where they might be in an organisation, a sort of one preferred profile of person, or indeed a prevailing culture that can be very, very strong in certain businesses and certain industries, I started to question that was creating a disadvantage, because there were too many people that were in a common likeness, if you like, rather than recognising that there were different styles that could be equally as good and indeed really complementary to the prevailing style or type of culture. So I've always questioned the one-size-fits-all leadership model.
The cookie cutter.
The cookie cutter, absolutely, cookie cutter. And I guess I also was on the receiving end of that throughout my career at various times, and felt that that perhaps because I might have a different style to, say, my boss at a certain time, was I sufficiently being recognised for the diversity? And there's so much data and research now about the fact that like recruits like, we recruit people in our own image.
Is that a human behaviour thing, that we tend to gravitate or find people who look and sound like us? I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but is there something behind that behaviour?
No, absolutely, Adam. I mean, it goes back to who we are as humans and individuals, and the whole bias. We develop biases as a shortcut. Because when people are very different to us, psychologists would say the amygdala may kick in, it may activate our fight or flight. And of course, when people are different, I always say that it actually causes what I call a trouble in interaction. It's actually less comfortable to work and operate with people who are different. I mean, we know when we're perhaps in a meeting and there's more challenge going on, or people are actually challenging the way we might be thinking about something or our perspective. Yeah. It takes a lot more energy, it takes more time, and can even threaten our self-identity and how we think of ourselves. So I think
it's also more exciting in a way, isn't it?
It's more exciting, but more difficult and takes more time. And of course, is more beneficial to have that diversity.
Take into account the work that you've done over the years, and I'm thinking myself as well. Do you think things have changed in relation to our understanding of the power of diversity of thought? So when we perhaps started our careers a number of years ago to today, what do you see has really changed in either understanding or application?
I think there's been a massive change in the right direction. Still a long way to go.
Work to go, right?
Work in progress, as they say. And I think there's been, we all know through a lot of the work that was done on unconscious bias training. I think the problem there was that used to
What did you think of all the unconscious bias training? That
I think
there was a plethora of it for a while,
in
wasn't
a
there?
sense.
Yeah.
But it often got people on the back foot. It sort of almost criticised people and made people not necessarily feel they could respond in the right way. And I think the research actually now shows that that only goes so far, and in fact can actually create a backlash if you're not careful, because people feel that their particular group or difference is not appreciated. And I think that caused me to do a lot of the research that I have done, because rather than the bias training, what I have done is really gone into exploring, well, what are some of the real differences about the way people think and the way people behave, the way we make decisions, our leadership styles, the way we communicate, with the aim of thinking if people had more awareness around that, then we would then be able to embrace people who are different. And also, we would be in a position, if we had a strong preference, if we wish to develop our repertoire into the style that might be different to us.
Okay. When you started to approach this, how did you take on the subject of categories? So male, female, or so, gender, ethnicity, other categories that we know full well within the workplace. Did you use those as a starting place, or did you in some ways go up a level and think, hang on, I'm just going to look at more of a behavior level from a tendency? I don't know. How did you approach that?
It all started actually when I was designing and delivering some women in leadership programs.
Right.
So it started very much from looking at the research from universities, from businesses around gender differences,
Right.
And the tendencies that men and women have. And I have to be really careful here, of course, Adam, in terms of there are some patterns and tendencies, but that doesn't mean that all men or all women have those tendencies. In fact, many of us might have the traits of the opposite gender, but it started from both doing that more detailed research
Right.
of the evidence that was out there, plus I had the privilege of having hundreds of conversations with men and women about what their experience, if you like, their lived experiences of
Right.
some of the differences that they both observed and they experienced themselves.
Tell me a little bit about, you used two words, tendencies and traits. Help everyone understand, what do you mean by that, and what was your focus?
The tendencies are learned behaviours in
Right.
a way, and that we could have almost another podcast on this in terms of the men and women differences around nature versus nurture.
Right, okay.
But just to sort of give a quick snapshot around that, there is a lot of research that talks to this, been going on for decades, the work of people like Elise Elliott, Cordelia Fine, that come to the conclusion that there isn't this pink brain, blue brain, there isn't really this difference in terms of the way that our brains work. Of course, there is, though, differences in terms of the societal messages around the way that boys and girls are obviously subjected to, and in the schooling and
Yeah.
their parenting, that can create emotional reactions and tendencies, learnt tendencies, that can then snowball into something much bigger and be there in the workplace years later, when actually it may not be serving them well. I mean, just to give you a couple of examples, and there's a lot of the schools have picked up on this, perfectionism. But, some girls in West London had Little Miss Perfect week, because girls can have a tendency for perfectionism, and
Right.
of course, if that then goes into the workplace, it can cause a tendency for women to be overworking, in terms of, and many very senior women that I talk to say they have to read almost every dotted I and crossed T in their boardroom papers, and that stems from their background, and that can of course mean that they may not want to delegate for fear of it not being perfect. There's a whole range of knock-on effects, which will vary, of course. We've got to be very careful. It varies, of course, for each person and each individual. But some of those, going back to your original question, some of those tendencies can be learned from our past and from society's messages. And there's a whole range of different ones. To give you an example.
No, I love this. I'm fascinated by it. I had Nick Jankel, who came into the studio, and he talked about an organisation is complex, not complicated. Complex because of the human organisms that make it up. And each and every one of us is unique. We bring our wisdom, our experiences, our education to work. And in some ways that makes up who we are and how we show up. And it's that diversity, isn't it? It's that uniqueness of every single one of us that actually is very, very exciting. And you wrote a great article that focused on the chemistry of difference. So tell us a little bit about that title in itself, because that's the title of this episode as well. The chemistry of difference. What do you mean by that?
Well, I use the analogy of the way that chemicals, I'm not a chemist, am I, Dad? But the way that
Neither am I, so I have no questions to ask on
chemical elements react differently when they come into contact with elements that are different.
Yes.
And I just thought that was quite a useful way of thinking about the way that people, when we come into contact with people who are different to us, we react differently. So, for example, I remember I had many experience of this in my leadership decision making. When you've got someone who wants to make really quick decisions, really sharp, really quick, versus someone that wants to weigh up all the options, the reaction between those two people is different. So I use that analogy to explore that actually we need to be aware when we're working, leading, operating in an environment, working in business partnerships with people who are different to us.
So when you think about that from a leadership perspective, you have to have that awareness that we're all different, and like chemicals, when together in different combinations, you get different reactions. How does a leader even start to understand that and navigate it?
The model I put together pulls out a whole range of different dimensions where from the research that I've looked at, it shows up. So it can be around, I mentioned decision making, the way we lead, the way we communicate, the way we rely on our expertise, etc. So I've created a whole set of categories. There's
10 components, I believe. Is that right?
The difference, right.
Each
of the letters, the D, the I, the F stands for.
I'm going to read these out so people have got them, because then they're going to be able to contact you. So it's difference. It spells out difference, doesn't it? So there's decision making, there's influence, followership, fellowship, elevating, relationships, engagement, negotiation, communication, and expertise.
Absolutely.
Have I got that right?
Absolutely. Well done, Adam.
I wanted to make sure. I have to do that justice. So those are the 10 components, and I'm going to ask people to get in touch, and we'll tell them how they can read about this. And I've got certainly one of your articles on this as well. Let's zone in on just some of those components that you feel are the most relevant to people listening and watching. They're all relevant, I know, but from a leadership standpoint, where should we begin?
Should we start with the followership, creating followership and leadership?
Well, with no followers, one can't be a leader.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's well known there are different leadership styles around. Are you a leader who is directive, more autocratic in your style, maybe more task orientated, versus a leader who may be more collaborative, more engaging, more coaching style to take people along the journey. And having awareness of those styles and recognizing that there's no one right style for every situation, but if you've got a preference or a tendency for one style, when is it that you as a leader really need to tap into the opposite style to how you are
and still be authentic?
Absolutely, and I think that's a key point that you raised there, Adam. That this is all about being an authentic leader, but knowing the lay of the land and when people are different, and if you choose to want to be aware of and sometimes tap into one that is not your preference, but you choose it, it still is the authentic you. I mean, McKinsey wrote a really interesting article a number of years back about collaboration, the hidden tax on women's career, which is extremely powerful, which sort of talks to the point of, yes, collaboration and engaging leadership is really, really powerful, but it can also be helpful to know where are the occasions you might want to step in and assert a clear, strong view, so that actually you're not taking away that gravitas from your leadership at particular points when it's useful.
Is this all really the leadership paradox? And I sometimes show people a slide, and it's a sound deck with sliders on it. Not too dissimilar, I'm sure, to what James is playing around with now. to make us look and sound great. But actually, a leader is forever manipulating the sliders in order to be appropriate in the circumstances they find themselves in. And also, if we think about what you're focusing on, in the chemistry that they find themselves in between the complex human organisms. So I'm always saying to people, it's okay to be manipulating the sliders of your own style in order to be effective, but also staying authentic. Is that a fair kind of analogy, in that we're always trying to, in some ways, manage our response and our reaction, take into account where we are?
I do agree with that, Adam, in the sense that there's no one style of leadership, and there's a lot of talk about the whole contingent on the people that you're leading,
yes,
contingent on the environment that you're in. And I do think we're in a stage now with the uncertain, complex environment that we're in, where we need to be more innovative, that we need to embrace the different styles. And of course, leaders being aware of this chemistry of difference, if you like, in their people, because also I think leaders are faced much more with increasing expectations from their people. People expect to be led in a certain way now. They expect to have this phrase that's used a lot around, feel psychologically safe to be themselves. They expect to have clear the leaders to tap into their own personal motivations.
So personalised leadership, that came up actually with our young leaders. Every single person is looking for some form of personalised leadership. How does a leader do that?
I would say that the one-word answer on that is to tap into emotional intelligence.
Right, okay.
And
it's also becoming more important than IQ.
I think they're equally important.
Can I say that? We take it for granted, the IQ, but...
No, absolutely. And I think in many corporate structures, IQ was the leading IQ, wasn't it, for many, many years, and still is in many.
It's important.
It's important. And it's not to be undervalued. However, I think in more recent years, many leaders have recognised the importance of emotional intelligence. And without that, the leaders can't be this human-centred leader that is now required, both, as we said, because of what's going on externally in the environment, but also in terms of the people that people are leading. Yeah. And of course, it's not... It can be developed. Emotional intelligence is not something that you either have or you don't. And of course, it's not.
We're work in progress.
Work in progress.
All of us. I mean, can a leader? Forgive me for interrupting, Sue. I love this subject. Can a leader be a chameleon? And that might not be the best way of describing things, but also be authentic. And I'll tell you why I asked that question. Is I met some amazing senior leaders, and they had all had international placements, where they had to go and work in a very, very different culture. And they spoke about the challenge for them to significantly adapt their approach and style and behaviour in order to be appropriate, but also find that level of authenticity so they were still being themselves. And that's not easy.
That's a great question. And this word authenticity has got so much debate around it. The way I always like to think of it is... you can be authentic and change your behaviour as long as you have a desire to want to change it in a certain way. And I love the work of Hermania Ibarra from London Business School, where she talks about we have to distinguish between our historical self and our future and present self. And I've got a very personal story around this one, Adam.
Okay.
For years, I was told that I needed to have more gravitas in the way that I spoke. And I could have thought, well, that's not me. Being more directive, being more assertive in the way that I spoke. But actually, I wanted to develop that gravitas because I knew that it would serve me well. So I spent quite a bit of time really thinking about, well, what is my style of the way that I communicate, the way I land myself in meetings? And actually, I did role model myself on some of the leaders that I thought were really impressive.
Okay.
So I changed. So one could argue was I being authentic? But actually, I think I absolutely was being authentic, because I aspired to be able to come across and communicate in a different way.
You were developing.
Absolutely.
And you know, I've spoken to some, you know, incredibly successful CEOs who, with great humility, say that they are still developing. I remember talking to Gary Ridge, who just stood down, who was the CEO and chairman of WD-40 for 26 years. And I said, Gary, what's next? And he actually said he described almost his tenure, 26-year tenure, as his apprenticeship in leadership. And I just thought, what a wonderful way of looking at things. So we're all developing.
Yeah, no.
And so that's why this is so powerful. So there are those 10 components that you've identified that I spoke about in this episode. So help us understand, anyone who's listening and watching, kind of where do they start in relation to really trying to understand the chemistry of difference within their people, whether they're leading small, medium or large size businesses. Anyone listening to this thinking, I'd like to be more mindful, more deliberate about this. You know, I'm curious and I want to know how I can do better or get the best out of people. Where should a leader start, do you think?
The starting point, I think, is very much around recognising that there isn't a one good style, and being really aware of the fact of how your style might be different to others. And by the way, Adam, one of the really important pieces of research, I think, is when people are more like us, we tend to rate them more highly. Right. So there's a big point there around how it is very helpful to be aware of the differences between people, right, so that we're not putting in an unnecessary bias. So I think being aware and looking out for differences and then embracing them as their different styles, and although people might be different to us, it's equally good, equally valuable. And in fact, one argues now, with all the diversity research that we all see, that actually it's essential in terms of being more innovative, in terms of the complexity.
It's a non-negotiable.
It's a non-negotiable.
And a non-negotiable. What are some of the benefits that you're seeing from the conversations that you've had and the research that you've done for leaders who have and are embracing this? Because, as I say, there's always a journey to this. What are some of the benefits that they're reporting back to you?
Certainly for the leaders themselves, it's enabling them to feel more comfortable in able to embrace the increasing demands on leaders. So they're able to update themselves in terms of their own style by being able to have what I call more quality conversations and quality connections with the people that they're leading.
There's that personal leadership piece.
Personal leadership.
Okay.
And of course, for their people, it's enabling them to feel that they are valued, that what they bring that might be different to their colleagues or indeed to their leader, to their own leader, that they're recognised for what they bring, the differences that they bring.
Okay.
And I think at the end of the day, as we all know, those teams that will be successful in the future are those that are the most diverse. I love the phrase that if everybody's the same, then many people are superfluous.
This is very true, isn't it? I do love that as a phrase. Wow. Can I ask you a question? We didn't chat about this when we met a couple of weeks ago. Any thoughts in relation to neurodiversity now? Because it's been mentioned a couple of times. I'm someone who is in that category, but some of the young leaders mentioned it as well, who also were in that category, and actually said, well, hang on, what's the role or focus on neurodiversity in diversity? Any thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. I myself am dyslexic.
Welcome to the welcome to the gang. Then
realise that I was until many years into my career. Actually, it stemmed from my daughter was diagnosed with dyslexia, and I researched this little aside. I researched into it, and I thought, oh my goodness, all of the reading around this and all the research was the things that I thought were
you
my
recognised
strengths.
yourself.
But I recognised it through the strengths, the
Right.
ability to make connections, interpersonal skills, the big picture.
Your superpowers.
The superpowers.
Yeah.
And my view on the whole neurodiversity piece is that it's about recognising people's strengths.
Yeah.
And it goes back to what we were saying about there's not one size fits all. And a lot of businesses and organisations are now recognising that you don't have to be average at everything. You can bring, as you say, Adam, the superpower.
Yeah.
And I'm very interested in what's happening in some of the more forward-thinking organisations around job crafting, whereby when they're looking at putting people into a role, they're not looking for a standard profile anymore, but they're crafting the role around the individual strengths. And that is so helpful and useful, certainly with people with neurodiversity, because they can really play to what is really strong in themselves.
Is that the future with everything that we've been through and everything that we're still to go through? We think about the pandemic, war, cost of living crisis, Brexit, and anyone listening in any, location in the world, there's just something and then there's something and then there's something. So it's the next normal all the time. So, with that in mind, where is this chemistry of difference now sitting? Has it gone right to the top of the priority list at the moment?
I think it's nowhere near the top of the priority list. There's a lot of talk about diversity. There's a lot of talk about inclusion.
Yes.
And there's a lot of talk, obviously, about the demographic differences around gender, around race, generational differences, and all of that.
Yes.
My view is that there still needs to be a lot more understanding around the differences around the way people think and the way people behave, irrespective of their demographics.
Those tendencies again of individuals.
The chemistry of difference model, because that helps people really get it. The problem is you can't measure it.
Right.
You can measure the demographics, but with more increased understanding about, as we started this conversation, the sort of mindset thinking and behavioural differences, we'll be in a far better place. But I think there's a much urgent need to create more awareness, not just in leaders, but in everybody, about what those differences are, and that actually we need to embrace all of them for the good of not only every individual, but also the good of businesses and society.
I'm glad you said that. It's not just the responsibility of the leader. It can't just be one or a few people's responsibility, can it? It's something that's got to be pervasive, part and parcel of a DNA, and not just in organisations. From a community, from a culture. I think it's important all around. How do people get in touch with you if they want to learn more about the work that you're doing, bring you into their conversations and their work? What's the best way?
My email address is sue@conder.co, just CO.
Right, that's easy.
And also my website is conder.co. And so I'm very happy to share the model, share any articles if people would be interested, just to learn a little bit more about the detail. We've just done some very headlines here today. Yeah,
can I encourage people to do just that? Because, you've really got into some of the research yourself, and almost set a very strong provenance for then the conclusions and the insights that you bring. What's next for you? I know you're passionate about this, but what's next for you?
I'm just going to continue doing what I love doing and what I feel so strongly about, which is working with leaders in leadership development, in the coaching work that I do, and just want to a stage in my life where I feel that I can hopefully share the experiences I've had from the 30 years of working with so many organisations. And be able to make a difference to people. So here comes an unfair question. With all of that wisdom, Sue, what's the most powerful piece of leadership advice that you remember that you've ever given or received? Well, the one for me would be about be mindful of your inner game. Tell me more. Which, in fact, Tim Galway talks about. Whatever outer game you're playing, there's always an inner game in your mind. So thinking about how your emotions, we can't underestimate the power of our feelings and our emotional reactions,
Right.
how we might be thinking about something and the need to reframe things that may be incorrect. Thoughts are just thoughts. And often we tell ourselves thoughts that are A, inaccurate, and B, are not
the
at all
stories
helpful.
we tell ourselves.
The stories, exactly, and not at all helpful. And I think the second piece is very much around just try it out. I use this word all the time in the work that I do, experimentation.
Yeah.
Try it out. See whether it fits. See whether you feel that it fits with your authentic self. Create awareness of things that you could experiment with. And it will either work and you'll think this is fantastic and great and something I want to internalize for my future authentic self, or it won't work, and that's fine. At least we'll have tried.
I have the courage to try in the first place.
Yeah. Feel the fear and do it anyway. It's been my
There we
motto.
go. I love that. I love that piece of advice. Sue, thanks so much for taking the time to come into the studio for the Leadership Enigma. Please, everyone, the chemistry of difference, it's something we all need to start to look at. And I like that approach, just having a look and being curious in relation to the tendencies of all of us. Where's that coming from? What does it mean? And when, just like chemicals, when you put them together, what's the reaction that we get? So thanks so much for taking the time to chat to me.
A pleasure, Adam.
All
Really
right.
enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
Join us again next week for more tips and strategies on the Leadership Enigma. We'd love to hear your comments on today's show, as well as suggestions for future topics and guests. Get in touch with your host on LinkedIn or visit the dedicated website, www.leadersenigma.com, powered by Transform Performance International, where you can access our exclusive learning, including books, videos, bonus content, assessments, and more. Please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on all your major podcast platforms. Thanks for listening.